So I'm going to be talking about joy today, and to get us started, I thought we would start with a little experience of joy. I hope you're willing to go there with me on this early Tuesday morning. So I'm going to ask you to stand up. This is one of my favorite things to do to find joy in the day-to-day. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to find your own happy dance. And I just want to say, before we do this, what a happy dance is and what it isn't. A happy dance is not a performance. It is not your best, choreographed dance steps from your 5th grade recital. It is not for anyone else. It is just purely an expression, a movement that gives you joy, that sort of is an expression of the feeling that you find inside you when you feel good. And to give you some inspiration, here are a few examples to get you started. So you can do the Carlton, always a classic, the sort of very wiggly Bill Nye movement. You've got Brad Pitt with the upper body. You've got, if you have no one near you, you could get into the sort of Batman and Robin with the legs, but just be conscious of your neighbors. So find a move that works for you. We're going to do this for not more than a minute, so it'll be quick. I promise. And when I press the music to start, we'll go, okay? All right. Ready, set, go. Yourselves a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing that silly exercise, gets the blood flowing. But there's another reason why I like to start with that. Not just because it's silly and not just because it gets our energy going in the morning. It's because of this. Sorry, I'm still out of breath from my happy dance. So in the pursuit of happiness, we often overlook joy. This is something I have noticed in our culture. And so it's probably worth me taking a second to pull those two ideas apart. Happiness. Happiness is a broad evaluation of how we feel about our lives over time. So if you were to imagine the ideal life that you could be living right now, and that's a 10, and then the worst possible life that you as yourself could be living right now, and that's a 1. Happiness is sort of where you are on that scale. And it encompasses a lot of factors. How we feel about our work, whether we feel like we have a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, whether we feel connected to other people. All of those things go into this equation of happiness. And so sometimes it's hard to know, am I really happy in a given moment? But joy is much smaller and simpler, much more immediate. The way that psychologists define joy is as an intense, momentary experience of positive emotion. And we can measure it through direct physical expressions, things like smiling and laughter, a feeling of wanting to jump up and down. Sometimes when I do this exercise around joy with people, people will say it feels like radiating. Right? It feels like energy sort of wanting to burst out of your body. It feels warm. It feels light. And all of those things are different ways that we can start to notice that feeling of joy and feel it more often. I think for me, it's a shame that these moments of joy get overlooked because small moments of joy actually have surprisingly big effects. And I want to talk about some of these. So first off, joy attracts. Joy is a contagious emotion. I mean, all of our emotions are contagious. We spread them to each other through our gestures, our tone of voice, our movements. Even our walks can communicate our emotions. And a happy dance is a perfect expression of how joy can become contagious. One person starts moving and that joy starts to sort of spread out through a crowd. But one of the things that's interesting about this is that it actually makes us more physically attractive. So researchers have done studies where they take these computer-generated faces, and they take average-looking faces that have been independently rated, and they make them smiling. And they take above-average-looking faces, these sort of supermodel, good-looking composites, and they make them not smiling. And what they find is that the faces that are exhibiting joy, no matter how attractive they were to start, are considered more attractive than the really, really good-looking faces that are not smiling. And this can actually have business implications. So when salespeople, frontline retail staff, exhibit genuine joy, people spend more time browsing in a store, they're more likely to return for a repeat visit, and they give higher customer satisfaction ratings. But it can't be forced, it can't be faked. It's just when it's actually genuine. Joy also sharpens our minds. So I think a lot of us think about joy as maybe a distraction from success. It's something that we find on our weekends and maybe on our evenings. But research shows that business people make better decisions when they're in a state of joy, that they actually take into account a greater variety of sources of information, and that they're less likely to anchor on an idea and get stuck and unable to sort of move off their initial idea. This may be one reason why negotiators, when they're primed to be in a state of joy, actually come to more win-win agreements. It sort of, again, decreases that stubborn anchoring. And some studies show that we are up to 12% more productive in a state of joy. These are just sort of simple piecework studies where people are sort of asked to solve complex tasks in a lab. And when they're primed to be in a state of joy, they solve their tasks 12% more quickly. So I think in a very real way, joy, though it seems like a distraction from success, can actually be a catalyst for it. Joy also opens us up to new ideas. So one of the theories behind the evolution of positive emotion is called broaden and build. And the idea behind broaden and build is this. If you imagine waking up in the middle of the night because you heard a bump, and that fear you feel, whenever we feel negative emotions like that, those emotions evolve to narrow our focus so that we can focus on immediate threats and challenges. So when that happens, when you hear that bump in the night, you're not thinking about anything else, right? You're not thinking about the future. You're thinking about the immediate moment, what's happening, and how to stay safe. Same thing if you have an argument with your partner, right? You're not thinking about anything else, all the reasons why they're wrong are just sort of going through your head over and over and over again, and just sort of playing themselves. And so those emotions evolve to help us address those challenges in the moment. Positive emotions, on the other hand, evolve to broaden our focus out, to help us think about the future and build resources for the future. And so when we are in a state of positive emotion, it's an ideal time to explore, to play, to grow, to learn new things. And the theory is that this helps us build resources for the future. One of the measures of this is cognitive flexibility, which is also, a form of creativity. We are more cognitively flexible in a state of joy. There's some research that also says that we are better at multitasking in a state of joy, though this is probably not a thing we want to encourage because we know that multitasking in general is not great for our productivity. But when we are in a state of joy, we are better at it than when we are in a neutral mindset. Joy also helps us change behavior. It helps us learn and sustain positive changes. Research shows that when we celebrate our little micro changes, that it actually helps us sustain these changes over the long haul. That habits over time can become monotonous and can lead us to sort of fall off the track of our sort of new behaviors in search of joy. But when we build joy in, either through celebration or by building joy into the habit itself, that actually helps us sustain positive lifestyle changes over the long haul. Joy also strengthens relationships. So research shows that when we share a moment of joy with someone else, it sends a signal to them that we're going to be there for them in the future, not just in the moment. There's also research that shows that laughing together with someone increases the amount of personal information that we're willing to share. So it increases intimacy and it decreases the barrier to forming a meaningful connection. So when we want to collaborate, when we want to form deep bonds with our colleagues, laughter and joy can be a powerful way to cement those bonds. And joy makes us more resilient. So studies show that little moments of joy decrease the cardiovascular effects of stress. They help the body reset from the effects of stress, which protect our hearts over the long haul and may even increase our longevity. There's also studies that show that when we experience little moments of joy, it helps us put catastrophic or difficult events into perspective. It helps us bounce back. I think, again, we often think about joy as something that, when we're facing a tough time, it's something we put off because it's something we'll get to it later. But in fact, joy can be a real tool to find resilience in difficult, challenging periods. So I think in a lot of ways, happiness, when we prioritize happiness, it takes us away from joy. We put off our hobbies, we put off laughing with our coworkers, and we just focus on the task at hand because we need to get to that promotion or we need to get to that milestone. But in fact, that often takes us away from what is actually going to make us happy. Whereas when we focus on joy, happiness finds us. Now, it probably would be good to take a step back for a second and talk about how I came to be here, because I didn't set out to study joy at all. I set out to study design. And it was while I was in my first year of design school. I was at the end of my first year, and I was at a review. A professor was looking at all of the things I had designed, and he said, "Your work gives me a feeling of joy." And I thought, that was weird, because I wanted to design things that were sustainable. I wanted to design things that were ergonomic. Joyful was not on my radar at all. But also there was this tension for me, because I'd always been taught that material things were not a source of joy in our lives. What was really the source of joy were, the intangible things. And that joy is this intangible feeling. And it had always felt to me like joy was this fleeting feeling. Like, we catch moments of it when we can, but we certainly don't get to predict when those are going to happen. We can't create more of them. So I asked the professor, and this panel set out before me, I said, how do tangible things create intangible joy? And they couldn't answer the question. They hemmed and hawed and talked a lot about intuition, but I wanted a scientific answer. I wanted to understand, how did this thing I made over here, how did that elicit joy in your brain, and how did that create that feeling? So this sent me off on a journey, one that I had no idea at the time would take me 10 years, to try to understand the connection between the physical world around us and our feelings of joy, this mysterious and quixotic feeling of joy. And what I found is that there is a large and growing body of research that shows that our surroundings do have a substantial influence on our emotional well-being. And that not only does that research exist, but that we can actually put that research to work for us in cultivating more moments of joy and, on a larger scale, happier and healthier lives. So when I first started out trying to understand, what joy is and where it comes from, I started asking this question: where does joy come from? And I started talking to people, just asking them about the things and places that brought them joy. And what I noticed is that in the beginning, I noticed that there were a lot of things that were really personal, right? So for me, for example, the wallpaper pattern on my grandmother's kitchen, if I see that pattern out in the world, it triggers an intense wave of joy for me, and everyone in this room could walk by it and probably not feel anything, right? So there are certain things that are personal based on our life experience. And I think that's why, because joy is so often personal, we often think that, it's entirely individual. But then there are some forms of joy that are also cultural. That might be a flower that grows near where you grew up. It might be a food that you grew up eating. It might be a sports team that you root for. These are joys that have to do with the group of people that you grew up with, the place, and those are shared by a larger group of people. And then as I was talking to people, I noticed that there were certain things that were neither personal nor cultural. They just kept coming up again and again and again, and here are a few of them. Cherry blossoms, everywhere the world over, and it's happening right now, right? We're all experiencing spring and we feel this intense joy. Bubbles, everywhere you go, a baby will smile at bubbles. Swimming pools, tree houses, hot air balloons, googly eyes, rainbows, and rainbow sprinkles. There's something about these things that cuts across lines of age and gender and ethnicity. They're not joyful for just a few people, they're joyful for nearly everyone. They're universally joyful. And when I saw them all together, it gave me this indescribably hopeful feeling. I think the world we live in often has a way of emphasizing our differences, that we're right-brained or left-brained, introvert or extrovert. And I think there's value in getting to know ourselves more deeply, but there's also a tendency for those things to draw so much of our focus that they make our differences seem insurmountable. And so it's really comforting to me to find that there's a part of each of us that finds joy in the same things, underneath all of that. And that even though these things are often dismissed as just passing pleasures, in fact, they're really important because they remind us of the shared humanity that we find in the common experience that we all have of the physical world. But I still needed to know, what is it about these things that makes them so joyful? I had pictures of them up on my studio wall, and it was kind of like analog Pinterest, well before Pinterest. And every day I would come in and look at this wall of things and try to make sense of it, try to understand what it was about these things that was so joyful. And one day something just clicked. I saw all these patterns. There we go, round things. So everywhere you look in childhood, you see round things, bubbles and balloons and balls and Ferris wheels and merry-go-rounds and hula hoops. And even children themselves are round, right? They have round faces, and there's a good reason for that. They have a higher percentage of body fat. It's one of the things that makes them so cute, their cheeks so pinchable. But there's something about childhood that is intensely round. And joyful. Pops of bright color everywhere you go, all over the world. When you see, a celebration, there's always color. And if you try to imagine it in black and gray, something just isn't quite right, right? There's something that color adds. Symmetrical shapes and repeating patterns. A sense of abundance and multiplicity. A feeling of lightness or elevation. When I looked at it this way, I realized that, yes, the feeling of joy can be mysterious and elusive, but we can actually access it through tangible physical attributes, or what we designers call aesthetics. And that word, I think, is often loaded. It's associated with art or with beauty. It sort of has a lofty connotation, but in fact, its roots are humble. It comes from the same root as the Greek word asthenome, which means I feel, I sense, I perceive. What these patterns were telling me is that joy begins with the senses. And so I started calling them aesthetics of joy, the sensations of joy. And I gave them names that related to the kind of joy that they elicited. And I began to notice more of these patterns. So for example, freedom, the joy we find in open space and wild nature. Magic, the joy of things that we can't quite pin down, things like the iridescence on the wings of a butterfly or the light shattered through a prism. Surprise, the aesthetic of contrast and the unexpected. Celebration, which relates to that feeling of bursting open that I talked about before, that sometimes we feel in the happy dance, that feeling that the joy can't be contained within our bodies. We often find bursting things in celebrations like fireworks and the pop of a champagne cork. And renewal, the aesthetic of blossoming and growth and potential. Altogether, I noticed 10 of these aesthetics of joy, and each one is a connection. It's a trigger that we can notice to find more joy in the world around us. And something happened in the wake of this. Once I sort of started to identify these patterns, I noticed that as I walked around, I was spotting little moments of joy everywhere I went. It was like I had a pair of rose-colored glasses or like a secret decoder ring for joy. And because I knew what it looked like, I was seeing it everywhere. I started calling this joy spotting, and it became a kind of almost mindfulness practice, a way of knowing that wherever you are in the world, you can open your eyes and you can tune your attention to something that is going to lift your spirits and start a kind of upward spiral of positivity. And I highly recommend, if you're ever having a bad day, to check out this hashtag if you're on Instagram, check out this hashtag on Instagram, because to me, it goes back to what social media originally was. Not, I'm trying to show off, I'm trying to show my perfect life, but I saw this thing, it brought me joy. I wanted someone else to see it too. So I was joy spotting, and all of that was great. And then I started to notice something else. That if these are the things that bring us joy, why are they so missing from so many of the places that we spend most of our time? Why do we go to work here? Oh, sorry. Why do we go to work here? Many of us do. Why do we send our kids to schools that look like this? Why do our cities look like this? And this is most acute, I think, for the people who have no choice about where they get to be in the world. So nursing homes, hospitals, homeless shelters, housing projects. How did we end up in a world that looks like this? We all start out joyful. Then that impulse toward joy is within all of us, even if we haven't acknowledged it in a while. If you watch children, no one needs to be taught how to be joyful, right? It's just effortlessly inside of them. And what happens as we get older is that being colorful, being exuberant, being playful, those things start to open us up to judgment. When we do those things as adults, we risk being dismissed as not serious, as frivolous, as self-indulgent. And so we start to hold ourselves back from joy. We separate work from play, and we don't even take all of our paid vacation days. Those are our joy days, and we don't take them. We feel like we have to dress and act our age. And so joy sort of gets pushed to the margins. I think it's important to recognize that this is a deep cultural bias. So if you look at Goethe writing in 1810, he wrote, "Savage nations, uneducated people, and children typically prefer vivid colors, whereas people of refinement avoid them." So, he's setting up an equation there that says that to express joy through one of the most obvious aesthetics of joy in our world is to be primitive, is to be ignorant, is to be juvenile. And then Adolf Loos, writing at the beginning of the modernist movement, he says freedom from ornament is a sign of spiritual strength, right? So he's equating this aesthetic of abundance, which we often see in the decorative patterning that goes with many indigenous crafts, many of which were practiced by women, that this is a kind of hedonism, that it's a kind of indulgence, and that morally we should be holding ourselves back from this. And so what happens is that we start to push joy, and we push these aesthetics of joy out to the margins of our world. And so joy can live in places like playgrounds and amusement parks and on beaches and nature preserves and in hotels and resorts. And the rest of the world is left to languish. And so the question for me over these past few years has been, how do we bring joy back to the world? How do we bring it back to the center of the world? And one of the places that this question led me was to an artist and a poet couple who believed that these kinds of environments are literally killing us. Their names are Arakawa and Gins, and they decided to design an apartment building that they believed would reverse aging. And so this is it. This is a real place. It's outside of Tokyo. I spent a night there, and it's a lot. It's a lot. You can see that the floors slope, so you have to sort of bounce around the apartment more than actually walking. And that actually, one of my favorite features of the apartment is that cylinder that you can see, that's sort of a cylinder on its side. That cylinder is a bathroom, and one of the funniest things about it is that to brush your teeth in this apartment, you have to hold on to the sink because your feet just naturally slide away because the floor is concave. So this apartment, it's a little wild, it's a little crazy, but what Arakawa and Gins were thinking about was that they believed that we don't just have 5 senses, that we have thousands of senses. And that it's by letting, just like our muscles atrophy if we don't use them, that if we don't stimulate our senses, that through our environment, that we will, that is what causes us to sort of, our brains to atrophy over time. And I think what's interesting is now, scientists say that we probably have anywhere between 15 and 21 senses. So the abstraction of 5 senses really is a convenience. So for example, touch, the sense that we think of as touch is actually 4 different kinds of receptors. We have pain, we have pressure, we have temperature, and we have itch. All of those are sort of different sensors that exist in our skin. We have senses of proprioception and balance that aren't classed among our 5 senses. And I think the bigger thing here is that research with animals now shows that when animals are placed in enriched environments, sensorially enriched environments, it helps to forestall the cognitive decline that's associated with aging and dementia. So Arakawa and Gins, while this is sort of wild and probably not a place that any of us would want to live or work, they were onto something theoretically in terms of how we think about our environment and the relationship between our environment and our minds. And I think a recent study that sort of brings us home to the workplace looks at, again, lean environments and enriched environments. So this study had, workers in lean environments like this that are just, simple, plain surfaces, minimalist features, and then had people working in more what they called enriched environments that had plants, that had art, that had, a greater variety of sensations. And what they found is that people working in the enriched environments were 15% more productive than people working in the lean environments. And when people were given control over those environments, they could move the art, they could move the nature, the plants and the furnishings around the way they wanted. That doubled again. People were 32% more productive in an empowered, enriched environment than they were in a lean environment. So I think, we've often designed offices as to minimize distractions. That's the way that we have historically thought about it. But that thinking is being challenged in a huge range of studies. So I think the bigger question for me is how did we lose joy at work and how can we bring it back? I think I talked a little bit about some of the sort of cultural forces that make us suppress joy. I think one that I haven't is, our Protestant work ethic. There's certainly another piece of this where we've been conditioned to feel that joy is something, culturally, it's not a religious thing, just a cultural inheritance that we have in Western cultures and particularly in American culture, that, our rewards will come later. And that, delayed gratification is the secret to success. And so we put off joy, we postpone joy. And then, the question of how we lost it in the environment. And I think there's sort of an interesting set of studies that I recently learned about called the Hawthorne studies. The Hawthorne studies were done in the 1920s and 30s. And they were studies of work environments. And what they were trying to assess, they were funded by GE because they wanted to sell light bulbs. And so the idea was they were hoping to prove that lighting would connect to productivity. And they didn't find that at the time. And what the study's authors ended up concluding was that actually it's only social relationships that matter at work. It's your relationship to your manager, it's your relationship to your colleagues, and that environment has no role whatsoever in our well-being at work. And so really, what our workplace design is based on that series of studies in the 1920s and 30s. It's why we had a huge wave of research in social relationships at work and how employees are sort of supported in the workplace, and no research whatsoever on the environment. And that is changing. People are going back and looking at those studies, finding that the studies were flawed methodologically, and that actually they do show some weak effects for the very thing that they were searching for light and productivity. And so all of that is being sort of upended and challenged. And so the question, how do we bring joy back to work? I want to look at this through two different lenses. First, I want to look at it through the physical environment and share just a little bit more from this body of research on how we can create environments that help people thrive. And then I want to look at it from a cultural perspective and look at some of the ways that we can, bring joy into a culture in different ways that are appropriate to different organizations. So I think for me, we can look at the aesthetics of joy as a palette, as a way of thinking about how we create joy in a workplace. And again, it's not one size fits all, but these are different ways that we can create joy for different workplaces and different working styles. These are schools transformed by the nonprofit Public Color. Working in New York City, they go into New York City school districts, underserved school districts, and they transform these schools with vibrant color. And what they have heard from principals is that attendance improves, both student and teacher attendance improves, that graffiti disappears, and that kids say they feel safer in these painted, colorful buildings. And then this is a bank in Japan. This was designed by Emmanuel Moreau. And it is certainly the most whimsical bank I've ever seen. When I went to this bank and I talked to the loan officers working there, they said, just invariably, I just kept hearing the same feedback. I can think clearly here. I feel good here. I can think here. This is what it looks like inside. And I was puzzled by this until I came across research conducted in 4 different countries as diverse as Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and Sweden, that shows that people working in more colorful and vibrant work environments are more alert, confident, friendly, and joyful than people working in drab spaces. So the color seems like it's on the surface, but in fact it has effects that go much deeper. One of the reasons why this might be the case, evolutionary theorists postulate that our color vision evolved in part to help our primate ancestors find ripe fruit and young leaves in the treetop canopies. And so on some level, when we see bright color, it's a sign of energy. It's a sign of life. Another aesthetic that I think is really powerful, and it comes back to what those original Hawthorne studies were trying to assess, is light and the influence of light on our well-being. Light is incredibly powerful in its connection to our body. Light synchronizes our circadian rhythm. It also influences our mood through its influence on serotonin, and it also actually also affects our immune system. So there are many different functions that are affected by sunlight. And I think it's important and interesting because Americans spend 87% of our time indoors, and we spend an additional 6% of our time in cars. So studies in workplaces show that when workers are given sunnier desks versus placed in windowless environments, that they sleep better at night and sleep more at night. They sleep 46 minutes more on average a night when they have exposure to sunlight versus when they're sort of housed in windowless areas, when they're working in windowless areas. They're also more active during the day. I think this is particularly important for shift workers, people who have circadian disruption as a part of their job. A study of acute care nurses showed that acute care nurses who work under tremendous amounts of stress, they have less stress. Their physiological stress responses are lower when they work in a sunnier ward. And the study notes that there was a greater incidence of spontaneous laughter on the ward that had more sunlight versus the one that had less natural light. There are also studies that connect light to learning. So studies that show that students, elementary school students in classrooms that have more daylight progress up to 26% faster in subjects like reading and math over the course of a school year than students in the dimmest classrooms. And there's research now that starts to explain why that is the case. Research in animals shows that animals that are kept in dimmer environments, their hippocampus, part of the brain associated with learning and memory, shrinks by 30%. So there's something about light that helps us not only feel well, but be our most productive. This is a lighting system that's being tested out by Philips, and it's being tested out in work environments, and is ideally, the way that they frame it is that it delivers a boost of energy that is equivalent to a cup of coffee. And it delivers it at sort of a particular time of day by using color temperature and by using the brightness of light to actually do that without sort of requiring people to imbibe stimulants. So I think this is maybe where we might see this going, is that we can use light in environments to actually influence people for the better. And this is a sort of a pretty extreme example out of Japan that I think is really intriguing. I think well known that Japan has a high rate of suicide, and that one of the particular places that people attempt suicide is in train stations. And so to combat this problem, they're installing all these barriers on the tracks. And this is time consuming, and it's taken a while to retrofit all the stations. So in the meantime, they installed blue light emitting panels on the platforms. And they started this in 2009. What they've found in the 10 years that this program has been running is that the blue light panels are responsible for an 84% reduction in suicide attempts in Japanese train stations. So I think this science is something that we're just, the way that this can be used in environments to improve mood, to improve well-being, is just, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. Of course, nature is another, well-studied element that can improve worker well-being in a space. This is the Kickstarter space, and what I love about this space, this is in an old pencil factory in Brooklyn. It's a dense space in the middle of a dense city, so it's a space that you wouldn't think would have much access to nature. But what they've done is they've created a core of a garden that everyone can look out on. And say what you will about the open plan office. I think the open plan office has its detractors, but one of the benefits is that nature, a view of nature is not a perk. It's something that everyone has access to, because you can see this sort of central garden from every space within the building. Research shows that when we have a view of greenery, it not only decreases our stress responses, but it also improves our ability to concentrate. It restores our attention, and it also restores the the sort of reserves that we have for dealing with people. So people become less irritable. We become less sort of aggressive and irritable toward other people when we have access to nature. So this improves not only just our stress and our overall health, but also the way we interact with others. And of course, if we can't have it, outside, we can also bring nature in through plants, and that's another way that we can sort of bring the benefits into a space. Research shows that when people have, brought plants into a windowless work environment, that it decreases stress, improves concentration, and it also improves generosity toward others. So again, it goes toward those social relationships. Even sensations like, we lost that one. Even sensations like birdsong, even just like, subtle uses of nature can bring joy into a space and can bring some of those benefits. Also, round shapes. Research actually can tie some of these responses that we have to specific parts of our brain. So when neuroscientists place people into fMRI machines and show them pictures of angular objects and round ones, what they find is that the amygdala, part of the brain associated with fear and anxiety, lights up when we look at angular objects, but stays quiet when we look at round ones. And you can, and one of the theories behind this is that we evolved in a world where angles were, often signified danger, whereas curves actually set us at ease. You can see this in the newly redesigned Sandy Hook school building. This is after the mass shooting there in 2012. The architects, Vigals plus Partners, wanted to create an environment that wasn't just safe, but also felt joyful. And that sort of brought a feeling of psychological safety throughout the building. And so they filled it with curves. There are waves running the length of the building and squiggly canopies over the entryway. And the whole building actually bends toward the entrance in a welcoming gesture. And I think, we often think of creative work environments as, as looking a little bit like this, right? A lot of beanbag chairs, a lot of primary colors. And I think this can actually be alienating. It can be somewhat off-putting. And what this allows us to do, understanding that curves tie to psychological safety, and there's also research that connects them to creativity, is we can create environments that feel more sophisticated, but that also bring that sort of subtle sense of safety and joy into the space. This is a co-working space in London called Second Home. And just one more point on the environment. There's also research that shows that the way we interact with our environment can affect the way that we think. So this is Pete Nelson. You may recognize him from Treehouse Masters. He's someone who taught me a few things about the power of elevation to affect the way that we think. He builds tree houses for a living, and what I thought was interesting was he sort of set out to be, originally he loved building tree houses, but he thought he had to be a regular home builder to make money. But he got so overwhelmed by people wanting tree houses for meditation spaces, for offices, for places to work and to think and to reflect, that he now only builds tree houses. And what I learned in sort of studying why people might be so drawn to having tree houses as reflection spaces is that research shows that elevation affects something called construal level. When we are at ground level, we tend to focus more on details. But when we have even just one staircase flight of elevation, it makes us zoom out. We focus more on the big picture and less on the details. So it's interesting to think that I think as this research evolves, we may find that we can design specific spaces for specific moods, that we can have strategy sessions in places that cultivate this kind of zoomed out perspective, that we can have creativity sessions in spaces specifically designed to bring that out in people. I think just as there's no one way to build a joyful office, there's also no one particular way to build a joyful organization. And so I want to talk through a few of these and just put out some questions that can help you notice if you have this sort of strain of joy in your organization. So laughter, research shows that laughter not only relieves stress, but it also improves productivity. People are better at solving puzzles, according to several lab studies, when they are in a state of joy, then after they've been laughing, then if they haven't been made to laugh. So laughter can be powerful in an organization. I think a question to ask would be, how often do you hear laughter when you're walking through the halls of your office? And some of this may have to do with the way that humor is used in an organization. Studies show that the most beneficial kind of humor in an organization is called liberating humor. And this is the kind of humor that challenges preconceived notions within an organization. So when humor is used just to sort of off gas and let off stress, that's useful too. But any alienating humor obviously is counterproductive in an organization. But the most beneficial type of humor is this type of humor called liberating humor, which helps poke fun at ways of doing things and helps challenge those ways so that you can find new ways of doing things. So I think the questions to ask would be, how often do you hear laughter in your organization just walking through the halls? And then what type of humor is being used? And is it safe? Does it feel safe to laugh in your organization? Small surprises have big effects. Recently, a study was done in a Coca-Cola facility in Madrid. And what the researchers did was they told people that this was going to be a happiness study, and they asked them to monitor their mood over the course of the study. But what they secretly did is they recruited some of the people working in this facility to perform secret, generous acts for people, surprise, generous acts. So bringing them a cupcake, bringing them a cup of coffee, leaving little notes of encouragement on their desks, little things. And what they found was by the end of the study, the people on the receiving end of these little surprise kindnesses were noticing 10 times more pro-social acts within their organization than they had been before, which meant that people, it's not just that these acts of generosity were happening, but that people were starting to pay it forward, not just give things back to the givers, but they were starting to pay it forward. Both the receivers and givers were happier at the end of the study, and the givers were still happy a month later. And this also influenced feelings of autonomy and competence. So things that have to do, much more with your job performance, but they were influenced just by empowering people to be generous. And so I think, what this enables is a kind of culture of helping that sort of fosters it through something that starts out as light and joyful, but can actually turn into something that's really powerful for growth within an organization. People, through these pro-social acts, build trust, and they start to know that they can turn to each other, not just for a cup of coffee, but for help with their work, for understanding how to do something better. Integrate play with every day. So one of the people I met on this journey was Dr. Stuart Brown. Stuart Brown is, he's in his 80s now, and he's the founder of the National Institute for Play, and he has devoted his life to studying play. And he says, the opposite of play is not work, the opposite of play is depression. And this is something that I learned firsthand while working at IDEO, and IDEO being an extremely playful organization. I think a question, and not every organization, I think the reason I bring these up is that some organizations, like a service organization, would be very, it would be highly beneficial to have one of those cultures of small surprises. An organization like IDEO, any organization that's working in a highly dynamic, unpredictable field, what Stuart Brown says is that play helps us navigate all of that unfamiliarity. And so play can be a really potent way of accessing joy when you are in those kinds of sort of extremely dynamic situations. A question I would ask is how do children engage when they're at the office? What does it feel like to have a kid in the office? And does it change the way that people interact? This is project at IDEO to redesign the experience of Monday. And only at IDEO would you be able to spend a day, digressing, trying to make a machine that blows the perfect bubble as a way of actually trying to design a more serious device, which was to sort of replace the way that notifications work in the office. The intention was, instead of having beeps that come out of your computer, you would have a bubble that would go up and let you know when your next meeting was. So play can be a way to sort of find your way to these sort of odd and unconventional solutions. This is another example, a project designing tools that help people navigate the financial crisis. And one of the places that we went to do that research was an escape room, a zombie escape room. And one of the reasons for that is that they sort of share certain properties. People under stress, we wanted to see how people under intense stress would react, and how we could cope with that. So we did something playful that helped us understand that. So I think the other question to ask with play is play just a thing that you do on the side, or is play something that actually is woven through the experience of the work? Because I think that's a way to identify whether you have a culture that really is using play as a route to joy in the culture. Celebrate the little things. So this image is of a confetti drawer. The confetti drawer is at the office of Tina Roth Eisenberg, a friend of mine who runs a company called Tattly. It's a temporary tattoo company, and she believes that she needs to have confetti on hand at all times. That's why they have an entire drawer of it in the office to allow for celebrations. Celebration, it was one of those things that I thought was just sort of a trivial thing, but in fact, when I started to study it, I found that actually lots of animals celebrate. So elephants, when they come back together after being separated, they stamp around, they pee everywhere, they raise their trumpets and blow. They're so excited. Sounds a little bit like a frat party. So it's very similar kinds of celebration, not office appropriate, not safe for work. Wolves howl together when they come back together after a hunt. And chimpanzees are the most celebratory of all. When chimpanzees in captivity, when a favorite food is brought in, they celebrate by hooting and hugging. And what researchers note, ethologists note, that the friendly body contact among the animals increases 100-fold when something joyous happens. And so what happens is all of this celebration helps to diffuse tensions in a society, in an animal society and in our societies. It diffuses tensions, and it also helps create a more egalitarian mode of being. So among the chimps, what's sort of intriguing about it is they all share food after a celebration like this. Every animal gets a piece, even though they're extremely hierarchical. So it disrupts the hierarchy and flattens things out. And so that, I think, is one of the things that's really powerful about celebration in an organization. So the questions I would ask about celebration is, are you celebrating only the big things, or are you celebrating the little things too? Are you celebrating the things that matter to employees, and are you celebrating the things that align with your values as an organization? Because celebration can be a tool for sort of influencing behavior in the direction you want it to go. And then lastly, joy starts at the top. I think this is just an observation from, seeing this in so many different cultures that, my experience at IDEO, we would try to, implement something joyful in the culture, a new kind of, lunch and learn sort of thing where, we'd have inspiration lunches and guests would come in from outside. And we would look around and no leadership was there. And the initiative would sort of fizzle out very quickly. Or we would, you'd see people, if you go to a happy hour or something, fun in the office. And if leadership isn't there, joy sort of fades away very quickly because it's at the top. It's when people take vacations. It's when you see people engaging in these behaviors at the very top that it makes it safe. It de-risks the experience of joy for everyone else. And when you start to have leadership showing up to those things, those initiatives would immediately start to be seen as important. So I think it's easy, it's tempting to feel like joy is something that can be handled by other people. It can be delegated, it can be skipped. But my observation is that in a culture, whatever form of joy you're looking for, having joy present at the top is really critical. I think joy often gets lumped together with fun. It's sort of seen as, this icing in an organization. And what I hope to have shown a little bit is that it's much more than that. It's much more of a connective tissue within an organization. That, we go to work because, not just because we want to earn a living, but because we want to find something that lights us up, that makes us feel more alive. And that at root is what joy really is. That, the drive toward joy is this drive toward life. It's what makes us feel more alive. And having that in an organization is a way to make people feel like they're their best selves. This is where you can find me to continue the conversation, and thank you.